Okay.
So let's,
We've
yeah.
got to continue. Okay. Hello, everyone. This is Amira from Interrupter. This is our third attempt to do this. And so I think some of you are coming in um, through the live stream. I didn't mean to do that. But in any event, I'm excited to have this conversation with two writers of a new, one is the editor-in-chief and a founder of The Dial, which is an online magazine of culture, politics, and ideas. And what I love about this magazine is that the writers are all people who are actually in countries outside of the United States, and that we're joined by Madeline Schwartz. And from Buenos Aires, we are joined by Lucia Cholakian Herrera. She is an Argentine journalist based in Buenos Aires. I said that already. Sorry, I'm a little thrown off my game. We are here to discuss a really terrific new book that is coming out on June 9th. It's called How We See It. The World Looks at America in the Age of Trump. It is a compilation of essays from around the world. There are contributors from India, from South Africa, Italy, Turkey, Cuba, Palestine, Egypt, Canada, Ireland, and the UK. And while the title says looking at America in the age of Trump, it's really actually not about Donald Trump at all. What I loved about this book, and I really did, is that it looks at America in a very broad range. So there's a look at the American economy, which I'll talk to Lucia about a little bit um, about American economic might. There's also a chapter from Ireland looking at American innovation and technology and the role that Silicon Valley plays around the world. Um, there's a great chapter by a Palestinian writer about what America means to a Palestinian in the wake of October 7th and the devastating war and genocide that has followed. And there's a really terrific chapter written by an Italian about the ugly American tourist, which I found to be hilarious, but in kind of a cringy way. Um, Madeline Schwartz is the editor of this book. She has a very profound introduction to it, kind of setting the stage of why this book was necessary. And I encourage everybody to get this book and to read it. Madeline, I wanted to start off with you and asking, this book is clearly directed at Americans. And I wanted to ask, what do you want Americans to take away from it?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much, Elmira, and thank you, Lucia. This is really fun. Also, my first live video, so for viewers, be patient. I will say just before I jump in that I'm the editor-in-chief of The Dial, and I edited this book, but I did so with the help of and collaboration of my wonderful colleagues. It was absolutely a group effort, and we could not have done it on my own. And as well as our wonderful contributors. I mean, I think I started The Dial in large part to combat a certain kind of American parochialism, which I think exists as much on the left as on the right, which is that even the fiercest critics of the United States tend to really basically see, the United States as exceptional and as a very pure form of democracy, as a standard for the rest of the world, so much that, as Lucia and I were texting about before we started, we call our country by the name of the entire two continents that it's located on, to the detriment of everyone else. And the Dial has been around now for 4 years. And in that time, we've published work from 85 or 90 countries at this point. And part of the idea of this book was just thinking about what can Americans learn from other places at this point in time, and what lessons, what periods of history, what can they draw on as they're confronted with the limits of their own country.
Great. Lucia, you author a chapter where you start off with your grandfather, who was an immigrant from actually what was the Ottoman Empire. He is of Armenian heritage, who had to flee as a result of the genocide um, in Turkey. You talk about how your grandfather had such admiration for the United States. How do you see the United States?
What a good question. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be here. I love the dial. The dial has not only allowed me to write about Argentina, but also they've been generous enough to allow me to cover the US elections from the United States in 2024, which I really appreciate because it's very hard to find American editors who trust reporters that are not from the United States. So I just want to say that before talking about this. So my grandfather, a man, he fled the genocide. My family is Armenian heritage, and he had an admiration for US dollars, which is what my chapter is about, right? Like this sort of like separation between the American currency and the United States as a country, and how it has influenced the lives of Argentines for the past, I don't know, 7 decades, 6 decades. So indeed, I when I wrote this article, I started writing these stories about like 3 or 4 years ago, and at that time, the U.S. dollar was at the center of the conversation of politics and the economy in Argentina. And I thought that was like the strongest moment of the relations between the United States and Argentina, and the influence of the United States in my culture and my daily life. Little did I know that like things would change and Javier Milei would become a president, and then like US officials will be taking part in cabinet meetings in my country just some years later. So it has indeed like changed a lot, but I think that how I see the United States is I was just really surprised reading the book and finding that many of my colleagues have like we have such different perspectives on what the United States is, but the answer, and I don't mean to sound lazy, but it's exactly how this book describes the U.S. Like this complex machinery of both like fascination and diversity and a sense of freedom, which I would question in many ways, but also I have also this like when I went to New York and other cities, like big cities, I saw like, wow, this is incredible, right? Like all these things happening at the same time, so much diversity and opportunities. But then when I traveled across other places in the US, what I found was like and this is of course my perception, but like the social life structured around consumerism, right? Which is not new. But to me, it was surprising to see so many parking lots, like parking lots and supermarkets and cars and bags and to me, it was like, how does social life develop around this idea of just like parking lots everywhere? And of course, a lot of other great things. I have a friend who lived in the US for 10 years, and when she came back, she said that it was she's always refers to the US as el país de las cosas, right? The country of things. Like there's things everywhere, and we are obsessed with things too. And of course, the story about Cuba is we have a very different perspective on the US for many reasons, but the idea of being able to buy things, regardless of who you are, where you come from, what's your paycheck, your situation, you are able to access things. And I think that's the main thing that stands out in my mind when I think of the United States.
Um, so your chapter really kind of dives in, and it's really about the US dollar, which is obviously a very dominant um, symbol worldwide. And I thought it was really interesting. You write in your chapter that as soon as an Argentine has a peso to spare, they'll trade it in for dollars. And for me, I, I just thought, well, what impact does that have on your kind of self identity as an Argentine and your trust in the government?
That's it's crazy when you put it like that because it's so true, but at the same time, it still sounds crazy to me to hear this. And yes, for at least, but so just to give a little context, Argentina had very strict currency caps for most of the last 10 to 15 years. So a big part of the Javier Milei wing, the libertarian government, and anarcho-capitalist, far-right anarcho-capitalist, very friends with Donald Trump, he won the election mostly pledging to dollarize the economy. So people were just sick of the political and economic instability of our country, which was in many ways connected to the and volatility of our currency, peso argentino. Of course, Javier Milei didn't dollarize the economy, but it did bring this conversation to the core social life, right? It is true that people save money in US dollars. I save money in US dollars. It would be hypocrite of me to criticize that. And it is true, and it's the way that we have tried to protect our little money from this chaos that we've been under for decades in many ways. But I think that more about the national identity, it is a question of sovereignty. I think that the loss of this idea that we can have a grip on the handling of our own country, that we need the wiring of a successful economy in order to be able to discuss the terms under which we want to live. And I think that's the most challenging thing that has been an ongoing conversation for a long time. I think the currency caps, they had this idea that the currency caps were aimed at many ways, protecting the economy, the national industry, blah, blah, blah. But also to in the long run, I think trying to build an idea that we were able to handle our own economy with our own language in terms of economy, right? Like the currency is the language of each country in the economy. Well, it failed for many reasons, but the I really wonder what would happen. Right now, we are in the middle of this process, this libertarian experiment. So it's very hard to see beyond this. But I really wonder how, if progressive governments come back at some point in Argentina, how they will develop this conversation, because it seems that now it is installed, that now that they've lifted the currency caps and we have the IMF and the US Treasury help, it seems like there's some sort of stability now, um, questionable in many ways, but uh, how we will develop a conversation about currency or money sovereignty in this country again, I have no idea.
So I want to pick up on that because you talked about the chaos that all of the dollarization and the Argentine economy brought about. And as I was reading each of the chapters, there was this sense of America was always seen as the stabilizing force, right? That was why Argentina wanted to dollarize its economy. Argentines traded their pesos in for the US dollar. But regardless of what chapter it was, whether you pick the India chapter or there's a chapter on Turkey, there is this sense that there is a dependence on the United States in one form or another. And what I found interesting about the book is that this is all tied to this grand idea about American exceptionalism, which you write about, Madeline, in the introduction, and the American dream. And we're slowly starting to see that unraveled. And that's something that has not just happened over the past year and a half that Donald Trump has been in power. We've seen that coming apart for quite some time. But at the same time, what struck me about each of the contributions is that even though we're starting to see this rollback and kind of the piercing of that American dream and that American exceptionalism, people around the world can't easily escape the being dependent on the United States, right? The United States has set out not just the US dollar and its economic dominance and the innovation, but you also write about soft power. So you have American universities and all of this. How can you kind of put that frame in how you manage to get all of these essays and kind of really kind of drive home that one point?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a complex fact, and I think in some ways it's hard to see from the inside, as it were. And one of the reasons I think that American exceptionalism stays on as such a powerful idea for so many people is exactly what you describe, which is that so much of the world has turned itself towards the United States. I think about this all the time. I live in Paris. I'm half French. I grew up partly here, but May is really the beginning of like what I call American season in Paris. There are just Americans everywhere, and I think about these visitors who could actually spend the whole day only engaging in what they already know. They would go to a restaurant and order from the English menu, and then go to a museum where many of the shows on display came from, the MoMA or some other U.S. museum, and then go to a movie and see the whole thing in English. And that does give those, those particular visitors the idea that, the American way is the dominant way, and that and that's what the rest of the world wants, right? Because otherwise, why wouldn't there be, why would, and it goes right down to language even. Why do so few Americans that one encounters speak a second language? Well, because the rest of the world, so many people are learning English. And I think that has really negative consequences. One, because learning many languages is really fun and good for your brain, but just on a very basic level, for thinking about the world. I had the idea for the dial back in 2018, 2019, when it already seemed like, so much of the world was turning towards this right-wing authoritarianism that is now, our dominant political way of being in the world, and feeling that the United States was really not aware or not looking at what was happening elsewhere, how quickly institutions were being dismantled, how much different bad actors were talking with each other, and that it would have really behooved the Americans at that time to look at what was happening elsewhere, and also what was working, to combat that. And yet it is so in our sort of national DNA to imagine that other people are going to be looking to us. Foreign students are going to be coming to American universities to learn from our professor. Researchers are going to be coming to our country, to benefit from our grants. That I think that change in mindset, will take a long time or may never even come. That's a question that I have.
So, building on that, Lucia, I think one of the things I really valued in your chapter is you talk about economic instability, and that has been kind of a regular feature of Argentine economics for many decades. And we're starting to see that here in the United States. I mean, I live in New York City. We had a mayoral election last year, and the big theme in that mayoral election was affordability. And you're constantly hearing, as the United States looks to midterm elections, about the economy, rising gas prices, food insecurity. And I thought, reading your chapter, like, this is such an important read for Americans to understand. How do you actually come to grips of living in permanent economic instability while also having kind of political desires, right? I think in the United States for a long time, we've been Democratic or Republican, and we've voted accordingly to that. But how can you just touch a little bit about how um, living in that instability, in that economic instability, can also actually have an impact on the politics?
I can only answer from my experience, which is being an Argentine, right? I don't want to, because I think it's very complex, and each country has like such a strong like background, and it's very hard. But when you say like the instability, but also having political desires. For me, at least, so I grew up, I was 8 years old when the biggest uprising of the last decades in Argentina happened, which was 2001. The government defaulted. It's debt to the IMF. People lost all of their savings. There was like crazy numbers of unemployment. It was really like the country literally broke. It had been brewing for many years, right? But I was 9 years old, so that's like my first connection to my country, in many ways. Because when you're a kid, yes, I live in Argentina, I'm from Buenos Aires, but like you don't really know, you don't really connect. I was asking my parents questions that no kid 9 years old should be asking, right? And reading newspaper, that we were very crazy. It was a very intense political and social moment for me. And I don't want to romanticize instability and chaos, because I'm a middle class woman. I own my own apartment. I know this is very hard for most people, much harder than for me. But for me, the only way that I have met with these political desires and this such like strong, straightforward community building has been through the economic instability in many ways. So that was the spark that led that you have to go outside and look for answers and to create consensus with others outside from the rules or the reasoning from the market or the state. And this, I'm mentioning the state not because it's not just a standard in Argentina, but I think that it also applies to authoritarian countries where we see that the lack of ability to connect with others and create community is also one of the objectives of authoritarian states, right? And I think that with the market, it is the same. If there is chaos in the market rules within a capitalist economy, then you have to go outside and you find it pushes you to do that. 2001 was that here. People were unemployed and they were not finding jobs. So they would just go outside, out to the corner and start talking with neighbors. And that led to gatherings and that led to roadblocks and led to a massive, and the president had to flee the government house in a helicopter. So I think that one thing that, and also, and I want to insist it that I'm not romanticizing, I'm just bringing like this insight that in chaos, you can find also the energy to try to build something different, because otherwise, if stability also many times means that you're staying and communicating and spending your time in the same conversation with the same kind of people, with the same kind of problems. Um, I think that the challenge to have political desire is to be in this awkward position where um, you have to disagree and you have to build something from that disagreement, from that critique. So yes, that's a part of what I would say.
I also think it's interesting, though, that because you touch on the fact that people are looking for community. And what I find interesting about this moment with Javier Milei as the head of the government in Argentina is that he's very much a Trump ally. And a lot of these authoritarian leaders, we see them around the world with type Erdogan in Turkey, with Narendra Modi in Italy, until recently Viktor Orban in Hungary. And they all kind of have found a community. And in many ways, as I was also reading your chapter, there was this sense of Malay found his way into power because he connected into that global strongman community.
Yeah. Yes, because I think that there is also a lot of political desire on the far right in that sense, at least from side of the voters. I don't know about the leaders, but um, the far right, at least in Argentina, and I think it might be similar in Trump's United States now. Like it has it attracted a sense of like rebellion and adrenaline that used to be on the side of the left, of the more progressive movements, right? So yes, absolutely, I agree with you. It is true that they have also built a community, and we don't know how long. I mean, I think this has a lot of years ahead in that sense.
Um, Madeline, I wanted to ask you, I know that you just talked about having this idea back in 2018, and you've been working on the dial for a number of years now. And you said you published about over 9 people from over 90 countries. What surprised you about in putting this book together?
Yeah, I mean, I obviously putting this book together wasn't expecting it to be a light, uplifting book, but I was surprised reading the essays that one of the theme that came across the most strongly, no matter where people were coming from and their their perspective or even their argument, was a sense of how broken the United States is, and that was something that came up in a lot of different ways. As we were putting together the book, to the extent that I remember when I was writing the introduction, I was texting with my colleagues being like, what is the hopeful message that I can put at this end of this introduction? And yet I think that there's something really clarifying in having someone else's perspectives, and certainly in the history of the United States, And I suppose that as I have French nationality, I'm like nationally obligated to mention that it has often been the outsiders who have seen us, the most clearly. And that goes back to Tocqueville. And so I think that there's a lot to be learned from that. One of the e- essays that really sticks with me from this book, and they all do in different ways, is Samia Roy's piece on homelessness in San Francisco in the Bay Area. So Samia is an Indian writer. She wrote a wonderful book about rag pickers in Mumbai, and then she moved to the Bay Area to, for work a few years ago, and was just shocked by how many homeless people were there, and also, and more than sort of their number, just how alone they were, because of a lack of resources, but also because of a lack of community amongst themselves, and a sense of shame that they felt, that many of them, many of the people she talked to, wouldn't even tell their own family that they were experiencing housing insecurity. And that coming from India was completely shocking to her. Um, and reading the book, I really strongly felt that there's so much of the negative aspects of the United States that so many Americans have begun to feel kind of inured to, because in some absurd way, we're so used to thinking that, the United States is exceptional, that if things are bad in the United States too, then that must be the only way they could be, because the United States is exceptional. Um, I'm hoping that this is really a time when people can look to other parts of the world and see that, other ways of being a country and other ways of organizing society are possible. No country is perfect, and no society is perfect, but that, this is a moment when we really have to look outside our own country in order to look for lessons and other ways of being.
I'm glad that you brought up that opening chapter, because that chapter really, I mean, it shook me. Because Samia does talk about having covered poverty in the slums in India. And the solution that she points out, she's just like, I don't understand why, like, there's not community organizing here. It's left up to the government, and then these individuals are embarrassed to either, let their friends and their families know that they're having economic hardship. And something that you said, Lucia, about how, Argentines see the United States as, the place, the consumerism, and, we have everything. Um, as the daughter of immigrants from Turkey, I grew up going back and forth to Turkey. And the one thing, having done that and gone through those two worlds, you really see that come into focus in this book of kind of what we value. I mean, there was always this desire to have American things, and that was, kind of a status marker. But especially in a place like Turkey, which is why I think the India chapter really resonated with me, there was a lot of shame if you did not take care of people in your community and in your neighborhood. And I, while I've never lived in Turkey, and I clearly, I mean, I don't live in Turkey right now. Um, the things that Turks value, much like I think what Samir writes about India, are very different than the United States. And yes, we all want to have a higher standard of living. And I think for a long time, that was kind of what we made the American exceptionalism and the American dream about. Um, and so that chapter really stayed with me. And I thought that the way that then the rest of the contributors came in, what was brilliant about it is not only how other people from around the world are looking at the United States, but offering those lessons of, you can have community organizing, and you can approach things in such a different way. But I also think it raised a question for me of, if if this American dream is sunsetting, and this idea of America around the world that has organized it for so long, what comes afterwards? And who organize? Like, we're talking about, at least in my circles, in foreign policy circles, kind of who's going to be the leader of the global order. And I guess the last question I'll pose to both of you is, what comes after that American idea?
I can start by saying I have no idea. I think that I mean, I'm really curious about what would happen in the United States. First of all, like with if it because it seems that it gets the whole China dispute and the hegemonic dispute between China and the United States is really bringing an identity crisis for many people. And I think that it's also raising. I'm seeing here in Latin America, so Argentina. I'm in the southernmost country in the region, and people are going crazy with China, not just because the relevance of China in the world order right now, but also because it seems like for the first time there is one country that is making the United States nervous after like growing up in a region where it was always okay if the United like we were just like stay still, let's not make the United States look this way just in case, and now it seems like some they're getting nervous about it, but I have no idea. I really do think that living in this region, I think that it would be incredible not to have one center in the north, because there is so much to develop socially and culturally and in terms of science, of, not just like knowledge. The circulation of knowledge is something that we have like very obstructed right now because of this idea of a center in the north. Yeah.
Yeah, I wish I knew. I would probably sleep a lot better at night if I knew what was coming next, but unfortunately, that's not the case. I mean, I think one thing that's clear is that the global order, or whatever we want to talk about, call it, that has existed, at least for the last few decades, has worked really well for the United States and not so well for basically everyone else. And I think it's really it's in many ways to the United States' own detriment that so much of the country's governing class hasn't really thought about the consequences um, of so much United States power. On the one hand, for many, it's been seen as a beacon of hope and a stabilizing force. But obviously, the United States has a long, long negative history of war, conquest, and interference, as well as all of the, perhaps more insidious, or less obvious, rather, I should say, consequences, like, having people's savings in Argentina in some way tied to how the United States economy works. Who is that really, really fair to? So, I think where it seems everyone in your world, Elmira, keeps telling me that we're headed towards this new multipolar, that's the big word, multipolar world. And I think the question is, is this going to be a multipolar world where people are all consensus building, or not? And that will change a lot.
Mm. Yeah, I think I think that's a really good point, and one that I think that this book really made me think about it. And so as we wrap up here, I want to thank you both for spending the time to talk to me about this really terrific book. I hope everybody will pick up a copy of How We See It. It's really a really interesting look at how the world is looking at America at this moment, and it really brings up a lot of different um, questions and concerns, but also answers. I think there's a lot of solutions in this book that we can turn to from different parts of the world, and on how they approach, whether it's the economy or innovation or politics or just society. So thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.